The room went completely silent when Grace Whitmore lowered her eyes and whispered the words she had spent most of her life trying not to say, "I wish someone would choose me." She had not meant for anyone to hear. She was sitting alone near the back of a community charity hall in Nashville, Tennessee, watching families arrive for an evening fundraiser while pretending she was perfectly comfortable being invisible. But across the crowded room, a millionaire named Jonathan Mercer heard her, and what he did next changed far more than Grace's life. If you still believe that kindness can heal old wounds, that hope can find people in their darkest moments, and that everyone deserves forgiveness, compassion, and a second chance, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes one small act of kindness can become the beginning of an entirely different life. Grace was 32 years old and had become an expert at taking up as little space as possible. She worked mornings at a small bakery, spent afternoons helping at the local community center, and rented a modest apartment above an old bookstore. She had no wealthy family waiting behind her, no influential friends, and no dramatic dream of becoming famous. What she wanted was much simpler. She wanted to belong somewhere. She wanted someone to notice when she was tired, remember how she took her coffee, and ask how her day had been without expecting anything in return. Years earlier, after her mother passed away and her father moved across the country to start another life, Grace had learned to stop expecting people to stay. Every time she allowed herself to hope, life seemed to remind her that hope could be expensive. That evening, the charity event was raising money to renovate a neglected neighborhood shelter. Grace had volunteered to organize donated clothes and food because helping others made her own loneliness feel smaller. She was carrying a box toward the storage room when she noticed Jonathan Mercer standing near the entrance. Everyone knew his name. He was a successful Tennessee businessman whose company owned hotels, restaurants, and several technology investments. Newspapers often photographed him at charity events, but Grace had never imagined speaking to him. He looked confident in an expensive suit, yet there was something unexpectedly tired in his expression. Jonathan had come to donate a large sum to the shelter, but he was not prepared for what he heard near the hallway. Grace was speaking softly to an elderly volunteer named Martha Collins, explaining that she was happy for the families who had found one another but sometimes wondered what it felt like to be chosen without having to earn it. Then, almost as if she were ashamed of the thought, she whispered that she wished someone would choose her. Jonathan heard every word. Instead of walking away, he approached her carefully. Grace immediately became embarrassed, assuming he had heard too much. But Jonathan did not pity her, and he did not offer some shallow promise about how everything would magically become better. He simply told her that perhaps she had spent too many years believing that being chosen meant being perfect, useful, successful, or easy to love. Then he admitted something that surprised her. Despite everything he owned, he had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him and had often wondered whether anyone would choose him if his money disappeared. That conversation became the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Jonathan began visiting the community center, not because he needed publicity, but because he wanted to understand the people Grace cared about. He helped repair broken shelves, carried boxes, and quietly paid overdue utility bills for the shelter without putting his name on anything. Grace slowly realized that his wealth was not what made him remarkable. It was the fact that he used what he had to make other people's lives lighter. But just as Grace began trusting him, a misunderstanding threatened everything. Someone anonymously accused her of using Jonathan for money, and rumors spread through the neighborhood. Grace was devastated. She had spent her entire life terrified of being seen as a burden, and suddenly the one person who had made her feel valued was being told she had manipulated him. So she resigned from the community center and stopped answering Jonathan's calls. For several weeks, she returned to her quiet routine. One rainy evening, while closing the bakery, Grace found Jonathan waiting outside beneath an umbrella. He did not ask her to explain herself. He simply handed her a folder. Inside were papers showing that the community shelter was finally going to be renovated. But there was something else. Jonathan had created a permanent community fund and asked Grace to become its director, because he believed she understood something money could never teach him: how to see people who felt forgotten. Grace stared at him through tears, unable to understand why someone like him would trust someone like her. Jonathan told her that he was not choosing her because she was flawless. He was choosing her because she had spent years helping people even when nobody was helping her. For the first time in her life, Grace understood that being chosen did not always mean someone rescuing you. Sometimes it meant someone recognizing the strength you had been carrying quietly all along. Months later, the renovated shelter opened its doors. Grace stood outside beneath warm evening lights as families entered rooms filled with fresh furniture, food, books, and hope. Martha hugged her proudly. Jonathan stood nearby, not as a millionaire surrounded by cameras, but simply as a friend who had kept his promise. Grace looked around at the people she had helped and realized something beautiful. She had spent years waiting for somebody to choose her, never noticing how many lives she had already chosen through her kindness. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by liking the video, sharing it with someone who may feel forgotten, and subscribing for more stories about hope, kindness, and second chances. And before we reach the final moment, leave a comment telling us this: have you ever felt like nobody would choose you, and what helped you keep going? That night, Grace returned to the same charity hall where she had once whispered those painful words. She stood beneath the same lights, but she was no longer sitting alone in the corner. Around her were people who knew her, trusted her, and needed her presence. Jonathan approached with 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her, and smiled. Grace looked at the crowded room and quietly smiled back. She had once wished someone would choose her. Now she finally understood that sometimes life does not answer that wish by sending someone to save you. Sometimes it answers by showing you that you were never unworthy of being chosen, you were simply waiting for the right people to see the person you had always been.